They must all have their little niche somewhere in my person or in my soul or something, yeah.
At 90 years old, Donald Sutherland was no longer interested in preserving an image. The legend had outlived the myth, and what remained was a man who understood that time was nearly finished. For more than half a century, audiences believed they knew him. The thoughtful presence, the intellectual rebel, an actor whose power came from restraint rather than spectacle. From the turbulence of the 1960s to the quiet authority of his later years, Sutherland built a reputation as someone above petty conflict, untouched by Hollywood bitterness. But 3 days before his death, that assumption collapsed. According to those closest to him, Donald Sutherland spoke with an unusual clarity. There was no anger in his voice, no dramatic flourish, just memory. And memory, when left unspoken for decades, can harden into something colder than rage. He did not talk about enemies in the traditional sense. There were no public feuds, no screaming matches, no tabloid scandals. What he revealed was far more unsettling, a list of people he had learned to despise quietly, men whose ambition outweighed their ethics, figures who represented the moral compromises he refused to make, individuals whose power shaped an industry he no longer trusted. This confession shocked even long-time collaborators. Many believed Sutherland was immune to hatred, that his intelligence placed him above resentment. Yet he remembered every moment of humiliation disguised as opportunity, every betrayal hidden behind professional smiles, every silence that allowed damage to continue. In those final days, he did not seek reconciliation. He did not soften his words. He simply named the truth, as he had carried it for years. 6 names, 6 people who embodied everything Donald Sutherland came to reject about fame, power, and Hollywood itself. So who were they? Which relationships left scars that never faded? And which name will surprise you the most? Number 6. Marlon Brando. Donald Sutherland never denied Marlon Brando's talent. In fact, he admired it deeply. But admiration, in his world, did not excuse behavior. And that was where the fracture began. To Sutherland, Brando represented a paradox Hollywood refused to confront. A man celebrated as a revolutionary of acting, yet increasingly careless with the responsibility that fame demanded. Brando's brilliance opened doors for an entire generation, including Sutherland's own. But what followed, in Sutherland's eyes, was a slow transformation from artistic courage into unchecked ego. He watched as preparation became optional, as discipline gave way to indulgence, lines forgotten, productions delayed, colleagues forced to adjust around a man who knew the system would always forgive him. To many, this was genius, being eccentric. To Sutherland, it was a quiet betrayal of the craft. What troubled him most was not arrogance, but influence. Younger actors learned the wrong lesson. That talent alone was enough. That commitment was negotiable. That respect for others on set could be sacrificed without consequence. Sutherland believed acting was a moral contract, not a personal playground. He never confronted Brando publicly. There was no explosive argument, no dramatic rupture. That was not his way. Instead, distance formed. A cold, deliberate separation. Respect for the work remained, but respect for the man eroded completely. In his final days, Sutherland spoke of Brando not with anger, but with disappointment, the kind that settles permanently. He described him as someone who could have changed everything, yet chose comfort over responsibility. That, to Donald Sutherland, was unforgivable. And for him, disappointment was far more enduring than hatred. Number 5. Roman Polanski. Donald Sutherland believed that talent did not absolve responsibility. That belief became immovable over time, and nowhere did it harden more than in his view of Roman Polanski. Their paths crossed through the shared world of European-leaning cinema, where intellect, provocation, and artistic freedom were often treated as shields against accountability. Sutherland respected Polanski's eye for atmosphere and psychological tension. He understood why critics praised him. But admiration stopped the moment morality entered the room. What disturbed Sutherland was not a single event, but the reaction that followed it. The way the industry closed ranks. The way conversations became careful, evasive, almost apologetic. He watched as excuses replaced judgment, and silence was reframed as sophistication. To him, this was not complexity, it was cowardice. Sutherland never enjoyed moral grandstanding. He disliked public sermons and theatrical outrage. But he believed in quiet lines that should not be crossed. When those lines were ignored, and when colleagues chose career safety over truth, something inside him withdrew permanently. He noticed how Polanski's name continued to circulate with reverence, often detached from consequence. Invitations still came. Praise remained polished. For Sutherland, this revealed a deeper sickness within the industry itself. A willingness to protect brilliance at any cost, even when that cost was human dignity. He did not speak loudly about Polanski. He rarely spoke at all. But in private conversations, he described the situation as a moral failure, disguised as artistic nuance. He rejected the argument that complexity erased accountability. To him, complexity demanded more responsibility, not less. What he resented most was not Polanski alone, but what Polanski came to symbolize. An industry willing to bend its ethics for prestige. A system that rewarded silence and punished discomfort. Sutherland felt complicit simply by witnessing it, and that discomfort never left him. In his final days, he spoke of this resentment with clarity. Not rage, not bitterness, just a cold acknowledgement that some talents were never worth the price paid to protect them. For Donald Sutherland, this was not hatred born of anger, it was rejection born of principle. Number 4. Donald Trump. Donald Sutherland rarely spoke about politicians with emotion. He preferred ideas, history, and long arcs of power rather than individual figures. But when he spoke about Donald Trump, the restraint disappeared. To Sutherland, Trump was not simply a political figure. He was a symptom. A public performance elevated into authority. A man who treated attention as truth and volume as strength. Everything Sutherland distrusted about modern power seemed condensed into one persona. Their opposition was never personal in the traditional sense. They did not share rooms, sets, or contracts. Yet Sutherland felt something deeper than disagreement. He saw Trump as the embodiment of a cultural shift he found alarming. The replacement of reflection with spectacle. Of responsibility with provocation. Of truth with repetition. What troubled him most was not ideology, but tone. The casual cruelty, the ease with which words were used to divide rather than clarify. Sutherland believed language carried moral weight. As an actor, he had spent a lifetime learning how a single line could wound or heal. Watching language reduced to a weapon disturbed him profoundly. Unlike many in Hollywood, Sutherland did not treat Trump as entertainment. He rejected irony. He rejected jokes. To him, laughter in this context was another form of surrender. He believed that treating destructive behavior lightly allowed it to grow unchecked. In private conversations, he described Trump as someone who confused dominance with leadership, applause with legitimacy. He feared the long-term consequences of that confusion more than any single policy or speech. Sutherland did not seek confrontation. He did not campaign loudly. His resistance was quieter, colder, a refusal to normalize, a refusal to excuse. He believed that history would judge moments like this harshly, and he did not want his silence mistaken for acceptance. In his final days, when he spoke Trump's name, there was no anger, only a flat certainty, a belief that some figures reveal uncomfortable truths about the societies that elevate them. For Donald Sutherland, this was not a clash of personalities. It was a rejection of what power had become. Number 3. Warren Beatty. With Warren Beatty, the resentment was quieter, more complicated, and far more personal. Donald Sutherland understood Beatty's brilliance. He recognized his intelligence, his instinct for timing, his ability to control a room without raising his voice. Beatty was not simply an actor, he was a strategist, someone who understood Hollywood not as an art form alone, but as a system to be mastered. At first, Sutherland admired that. But admiration shifted as he watched how power was used, how charm became leverage, how conversations changed depending on who was listening. Beatty navigated Hollywood like a chessboard, always thinking several moves ahead. To many, this was professionalism. To Sutherland, it felt calculating. What troubled him was not ambition itself. Sutherland respected ambition when it served the work. What unsettled him was ambition that quietly displaced others. Projects redirected. Credits negotiated behind closed doors. Decisions made that benefited one vision while diminishing another, all wrapped in politeness and intelligence. There was no single betrayal that defined their distance. Instead, it was accumulation. A series of moments where Sutherland felt art had been subordinated to control, where sincerity was replaced by management. He began to sense that collaboration, in Beatty's world, always had a center of gravity. And that gravity was Beatty himself. Sutherland believed acting required vulnerability, a willingness to lose control, to risk being smaller than the moment. Watching Beatty maintain dominance, even in creative spaces, created an unease he never resolved. They remained civil. They remained professional. Publicly, there was respect. Privately, distance grew. Sutherland chose roles and environments where he felt the work mattered more than the power dynamics surrounding it. In his final reflections, Sutherland spoke of Beatty, not with anger, but with a kind of sadness. He described him as someone who could have let go more often, trusted the moment more deeply, and allowed others to share the weight of creation. For Sutherland, this was not hatred fueled by conflict. It was disappointment shaped by proximity. And sometimes, he believed, disappointment lingered longer than any open feud. Number 2. Jon Voight. With Jon Voight, the fracture did not begin with art. It began with values. Donald Sutherland had always believed that actors carried a responsibility beyond the screen. Not to instruct audiences, but to remain honest. To question power, rather than orbit around it. For many years, he assumed Voight shared that instinct. They came from a similar generation. Both shaped by the turbulence of the 1960s, both beneficiaries of a Hollywood that once encouraged dissent. Over time, that shared ground disappeared. What unsettled Sutherland was not Voight's political stance alone, but the transformation that accompanied it. He watched as conviction hardened into certainty, as nuance gave way to proclamation. Where questions once existed, there were now declarations delivered with moral finality. Sutherland believed certainty was dangerous, especially when paired with celebrity. He distrusted voices that spoke in absolutes, because he had spent a lifetime portraying characters shaped by contradiction. To him, complexity was not weakness, it was truth. Private conversations became strained. Not hostile, but brittle. Sutherland sensed that dialogue was no longer possible. Only positioning. He felt that Voight had chosen alignment over inquiry, loyalty over skepticism. That choice, to Sutherland, marked a turning point. What hurt most was not disagreement, it was estrangement. The realization that two artists who once stood on similar ground no longer spoke the same language. Sutherland did not attempt to persuade, he did not argue publicly. He simply withdrew. Withdrawal, for him, was a form of judgment. In his later years, he spoke of Voight with restraint, but also with finality. He described the relationship as one that could not be repaired because it no longer rested on shared principles. Respect remained for the early work, but the man Voight had become represented something Sutherland could not reconcile with his own beliefs. In his final days, when he reflected on this distance, there was no bitterness, only acceptance. An understanding that some separations are not the result of conflict, but of divergence. Two paths that once ran parallel, slowly moving apart until the space between them could no longer be crossed. For Donald Sutherland, This was not a personal vendetta. It was a line quietly drawn and never erased. Number 1. Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein was not simply a name Donald Sutherland disliked. He was the line that ended all patience. For years, Sutherland had sensed that something was wrong with the way power moved through Hollywood. Doors opened too easily for some, closed too firmly for others. Rumors circulated, never confirmed, never denied, always pushed aside in the name of careers and contracts. Like many, Sutherland noticed. Unlike many, he never confused ignorance with innocence. What made Weinstein unforgivable in Sutherland's eyes was not only the abuse itself, but the system that protected it. A culture of fear, disguised as professionalism, silence, dressed up as discretion, complicity rewarded with access. Sutherland had spent his life choosing roles carefully, often stepping away from projects that felt morally hollow. He believed the industry could be flawed without being corrupt. Weinstein destroyed that belief. He embodied a structure where power existed solely to be exploited, and where human cost was treated as collateral. What disturbed Sutherland most was how long it took for truth to matter. How many people knew, suspected, or sensed something, yet continued to benefit. He saw careers rise on the back of silence, awards handed out, while damage accumulated in the shadows. To him, this was not a scandal. It was an indictment. He never spoke theatrically about Weinstein. There were no emotional speeches, no public condemnations filled with fury. His rejection was colder, more absolute. He referred to Weinstein as proof that the industry had lost its moral compass, and that talent had become an excuse for cruelty. In private conversations near the end of his life, Sutherland described Weinstein as the figure he wished Hollywood had confronted earlier, not because exposure would have redeemed the industry, but because silence had already condemned it. This was the name he spoke last, not with anger, not with relief, but with certainty. For Donald Sutherland, Weinstein represented everything he refused to become, everything he despised about unchecked power, and everything he feared Hollywood might never fully escape. And when he finally said the name out loud, 3 days before the end, it was not a confession. It was a verdict. In the final days of his life, Donald Sutherland did not speak as a man settling scores. He spoke as someone closing a long internal chapter. The 6 names he revealed were not trophies of bitterness. They were markers. Each one represented a moment where his belief in the industry, in people, or in shared values, had quietly fractured. None of these resentments were explosive. They did not burn outward. They cooled, hardened, and stayed with him. What is striking is what he did not do. He did not dramatize his anger. He did not ask for apologies. He did not seek public validation. Instead, he allowed himself a rare honesty, one that had been postponed for decades out of professionalism, restraint, and perhaps hope. Donald Sutherland spent a lifetime portraying flawed men, leaders who failed quietly, rebels who compromised, fathers who carried regret behind calm faces. In the end, his own truth mirrored those characters. He had loved his craft deeply, but he had never been blind to the cost of power. He had believed in collaboration, but he had learned how easily collaboration could become exploitation. He had trusted people, and he had learned how often trust went unanswered. Yet this was not a story of hatred defining a life. Sutherland did not die consumed by resentment. He died having named it, placed it where it belonged, and left it behind. The clarity came late, but it came clean. By speaking the names, he freed himself from carrying them any longer. What remains is a legacy built not on vengeance, but on integrity. A career shaped by choice. A man who walked away when he needed to, who stayed silent when noise would have been easier, and who finally, at the very end, allowed himself the truth without embellishment. Perhaps that is the final lesson he leaves behind. Fame does not erase memory. Success does not cancel disappointment. And silence, no matter how dignified, still carries weight. Donald Sutherland understood that weight, and only when he was ready to leave did he set it down.